So this morning, what I want to do is continue that series we started last week, looking at what it means to be with Jesus, to be alone with him. That working definition of abiding is us and God alone together. And after last week, we looked at Silence and Solitude, introduced this habit of Jesus around just getting alone with him, shutting out all the distractions and being able to just do time together, time of intimacy where God speaks to us, where we can process some of that stuff. And ultimately where we can just rest in his love. And after last week, I've been doing this for a while, but I was so excited again, Monday morning, get into God's presence, right. Had my timer set, ready, and then just all this emotion hit me. And I found it really difficult to concentrate. I said last week that we start getting some thoughts coming up as we shut out the external distraction. But I just found it so difficult. And I just really started processing this with God. And I realised that I was faced with just this anxiety, something that I hadn't really been aware of, but this low-grade anxiety. And I don't want to be dramatic about it, but just with being in the house most of the time, allowed out for our exercise once a day, with taking church online, more thinking about, well, what's the future of Lighthouse and the after? How do we transition to being online, to be meeting together again, wanting to do that well? The fact that leading through this time of crisis, and you know what, guys, I miss you all so much. I miss seeing you, miss giving you a hug. Like, we just love you guys and all of that. And then just personally as well, wanting to make the most of this time. What are the disciplines and practices? And I don't want to put too much pressure on ourselves, but I wanted to come out of this a better person. And all of this just built up to just some of this anxiety. And then, great, I took that to God, I was able to talk to him about it. But then, as I've gone through the week, he's taken me deeper. He's actually been showing me some of the motives of my heart. What are the wants and desires that are driving some of the ways that I act why I do? Why do I feel insecure in certain areas? And to be honest, it's been a hard week. I'll talk a bit more about it later. But I just want to say from the start, this is what I'm going to talk about today is very much a work in practice for me. I've seen the skin of the onion being rolled back and just seen this whole new world of Ross and his emotions and his desires. So I'd be a hypocrite to say that I've got this nailed. I might as well preach this to myself. But I think I've got some truths here that we can apply to each of us. And after all, this is kind of the heart of what I've been talking about, that as we be with Jesus, we become like him and ultimately we do what he does. And the fact is, as we spend time in silence and solitude, as I encouraged us to do last week, and if you haven't done it so far, no guilt, no shame. We need to work out the practices that work for us and what they look like, but I encourage you to try it, experiment. But as we get away from the external noise, our phones, the distractions, our schedule, chores, those inner voices do come to the surface, those thoughts. And last week we heard Henry Now, and he mentioned in one of his quotes that this inner chaos comes to the surface, our hopes, our fears, our anxieties, dreams, fantasies, passions, worries, joys. It all comes to the surface. And last week we spoke a bit about actually as we learn to silence those voices, we can come into the presence of God and we can do life with him. We become more centered in him, that peace, us and God just doing intimacy together. But someone quite rightly in the week messaged me and said, well, actually, are we supposed to be emptying our minds of all these emotions? And actually, that's not really the case. There is a case that intimacy is driven by us and God alone together. But at the same time, we're emotional beings. Emotions are part of being human. I was reading a cultural commentary on the pandemic, and I really don't want to mention it too much this week. But they were just saying that adrenaline and rush of the pandemic has faded a bit, and the reality of a new way of life, as well as the grief, is beginning to settle in. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking, yeah, that's so true. It feel originally like the lockdown felt maybe a bit like a snow day. It's all a bit disruptive and new and different. But as that sort of adrenaline kick wears off, the new normal settles in. I think there is an element of grieving our normal lives. And I just encourage you to process that a bit. But we're all going to be feeling different things at different times. Not just pandemic, and I promise you that's the last I'm going to mention it. But relating to our lives, maybe loneliness, Maybe we're alone at this time. Maybe it's the friction of the fact that we're in our house with our spouse or our children all the time. Maybe it's the pressure that's coming with work or the fact that we're now not working. There's a lot for us to process. And so it's not a case of just emptying our minds. I think Silence and Solitude also has a role of enabling us to process our emotions in a healthy way. John Piper, he puts it like this. He said, God designed your emotions to be gauges, not guides. They're meant to report to you, not dictate to you. The pattern of your emotions, and not every caffeine-induced or sleep-deprived one, will give you a reading on where your hope is, because they are wired into what you believe and value, and how much. That's why emotions like delight, affection, fear, anger, joy, etc. are so important in the Bible. They reveal what your heart loves, trusts, and fears. One interesting thought, that our emotions can either be gauges. How well is our heart doing? What's the health of our heart? As we look at becoming like Jesus, often our emotions are pointers as to how well we're doing that. We spoke about how the things we do inform our heart, that in the words of Jamie K. Smith, we become what we do. The idea that habits build something in our hearts which inform our desires and in return govern our behaviour. But our emotions are a check on the state of our heart. How are we doing in that process of habit and desire and want and love? Our emotions are designed to be a gauge on that. Or our emotions can be guides, where actually our emotions inform who we are and how we behave. Last week I called this living from the surface. And this is an unhealthy place to be. That if we're just living from a place of emotion, it's just a responsive way. We're not living from that Christ-centered core of who we really are and our wants and our desires. We're just being reactionary. Because the reality is that our emotions, are just thoughts. And there's an analogy often used, which I find really helpful, that if we think of ourselves, that our heart, our spirit, so what's going on under the surface, we think our spirit's abiding with God, and we spoke a lot about spending time with Jesus. That's almost like a mountain. The analogy is that our real selves is a mountain. Our emotions are like the weather going on around the mountain. There can be sunny weather, there can be rain, there can be snow, all sorts of different emotions. But the emotions aren't us. They're just what's going on around us. And I think that's a really interesting thought. Sometimes we can take our emotions and think, that is me. But I really believe our emotions are a reflection of how am I doing? But what I'm going to talk today about is as we go through Silence and Solitude, and even as we just think about our emotions, are they gauges? Are they a measure of our real health? Or are they guides? Are they telling us how we should be acting? And I don't think it's any coincidence that David's prayer in Psalm 26, he says, "Put me on trial, Lord, and cross-examine me. Test my motives and my heart." David isn't saying, examine my emotions. Am I feeling the right things? He's actually saying, God, go to that deeper level, that mountain level. How am I doing at a heart and love and a motive level? So ultimately, it's the heart that counts, not our emotions, because the core of us is our heart. That drives what we love. And our emotions almost come from that. And so when we talk about emotional health, if our emotions become guides and not gauges, then we're becoming emotionally unhealthy. We're living from the surface. We're living reactionally. We're living from a place of weakness and not a place of strength. If we're saying that Silence and Solitude is about our spirit having intimacy with God at a deep level, our emotions are almost the opposite of that. It's just living from surface, living from the flesh and not from the spirit. But the beautiful thing is, as we learn to do Silence and Solitude and live with and hear more from our emotions, we'll become more aware of them. Last week, I said that from that place of abiding, just us and Jesus, we need to be able to cut through that inner chaos, our emotions, in order to hear the voice of Jesus. But the same is true that we can journey through our emotions. What are they saying to us? What are they saying to us about the health of our heart and how we're doing? So I'm going to look a bit at that today. And I just want to bring to mind that vision that Jesus gave us last week in the words of Matthew 11, where I think this is so beautiful. He says this: "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me and watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." And I really believe that to learn to live freely and lightly is about learning to manage our emotions, to understand what they're telling us, but ultimately to put our emotions in their right place, that they're gauges, gauges of how our heart's doing. They're not guides telling us or dictating to us how we should be living. And so let's start. What are our gauges telling us? And our lifestyles, this modern lifestyle that we live in, allows us to go at 100 miles an hour. Whether that's through our schedule, back to back, doing stuff with work and living in a house and living with our family and the things that we want to watch, and we've got messages coming in, and our hobbies and activities that we're trying to squeeze and make time for, and eating and the general stuff. Like, we're going so quick. And so when we set time aside, it's natural that our emotions come to our surface. We're exposed where we're at, who we are. And in Western society, I really believe that we view suffering and that uncomfortableness that comes with negative emotions as something that's to be avoided at all costs. We don't look at suffering through the lens of something that actually teaches us, something that we can learn. We see it as an unnecessary interruption, something to be avoided at all costs. And so if we're doing everything we can to avoid sadness or to avoid discomfort, no wonder that as a society we don't make time for silence and solitude. No wonder we avoid times of silence. And I was reading in the week that the listening of podcasts has massively gone down over the last couple of weeks. And the article was saying that actually it's because when we're commuting and when we're going to the gym or maybe when we're doing other activities, we like to put a podcast on. And yes, maybe it's about digital addiction. We like to have input coming in all the time. But I think as well, we don't like silence. As a society, we don't like being alone with our thoughts. We don't really know what to do with them. At work, we have this app called Unmind, which is essentially, or similar to Headspace, if you're aware of that, but it's a mindfulness app where it just takes you through a guided meditation. And I like to do it with my team. I use it for a point for prayer, but where we're just rushing from meeting to meeting, sometimes it's really nice just to slow down for a couple of minutes, just be still, get away from the stress. But it's interesting how many of the team find that deeply uncomfortable. Quite often they'll try and do some emails on the side, or they'll laugh, or they'll just say, "I'm not doing this," and walk out. And I've tried to push through a little bit with my team, but I think it's because when they're alone and silent, the emotions, the state of their heart comes up. I don't really know what to do with that. And so this week, if any of you were trying out this practice of silence and solitude, and again, if you haven't, it's a new week, but no pressure, no guilt, no shame. But if you did try this week, for how many of you, once you got alone and silence with God, did some of those emotions come up that were mainly a bit uncomfortable, maybe emotions that you weren't expecting? Are we in touch with our emotions? And I'll be honest, I don't know if I really have been in the past. And I don't want to just talk as if I've had this fresh revelation of, this new me, but actually taking time to be reflective, to do this practice of silence and solitude, to be more self-aware has been pretty transformative for me. As I've slowed down, I've started to ask myself, and the same question to you, how many of you ask yourselves these questions? What am I feeling? Just being aware of what the emotion comes up. Deeper than that, why am I feeling this? Can we relate how we're feeling to what's going on in our heart and our lives? And further still, the deepest question, what is what I'm dealing with telling me about the state of my heart? What is what I'm feeling telling me about the state of my heart? How are we doing based on what our emotions are telling us? Putting our emotions in a proper place of being a gauge. And don't forget that God feels a whole range of emotions too. He feels joy and love and anger and pleasure. then emotions aren't bad in themselves. So let's take a look at scripture. Let's have a look at Jesus. And for Jesus, he had a high level, the highest level of emotional intelligence. He was the perfect human. He demonstrates to us how to deal with our emotions. So for him, emotions, positive or negative, were an opportunity and a place for him to meet with God. So let's turn to Luke 22. And this is when Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. It's just before he knows he's going to go off and be crucified. Jesus knows what's going to happen to him. He's feeling deep anguish and sorrow. And so we read this, verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer, he went back to the disciples and found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation." And so Jesus is feeling all these emotions. He's feeling anguish, sorrow, dread. He knows what the future holds for him. But he processes his emotions with God. He names them, and more on that later. He tells God how he's feeling and processes them in front of him. We read that he says, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will be done." And so as he processes his emotions, as he names what he's feeling, it leads him to a place of surrender, an abandonment to the will of the Father. That his emotions are almost the weather going through the mountain, round the mountain. But the mountain itself, his inner being, he's surrendering to God and saying, "Actually, Father, what you will, I'm able to do." We read that he's strengthened through this. And you're right in thinking that this seems similar to last week. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. He goes into the Eremos. He goes alone into the wilderness, and actually takes some disciples with him. And sometimes when we're processing strong emotions, that we might want to do that with other people praying for us. But ultimately, he goes to that place, just him alone with God, and processes those emotions. Other times, you can think Jesus had different times in his life where he would have felt different things. You know, the joy when he calls disciples and they follow him, they drop what they're doing. When he teaches about communion, that people need to eat his flesh and drink his blood, and people didn't really understand. And all the followers leave him but the 12, and he turns to the 12 and says, "Are you going to leave me too?" And they say, "Well, where would we go?" Great response. But you know, you can imagine throughout his life, Jesus goes through the emotional highs of healing and lows and all of that. I believe when we read, Jesus goes into the Eremos, goes into the wilderness, goes alone to pray. He's processing those emotions with God, not letting his reactions be driven by what's happened. Taking the emotions to God, what is this telling me about my heart? Processing them in front of him, and ultimately coming to that place of surrender where we can pray, "God, your will be done." But of course, different emotions call for different types of prayer. If you're happy, we can celebrate, we can sing, we can dance. If we're grateful, let's tell God what we're grateful for specifically and praise him for it. If we're anxious, let's name it. As I was saying at the start of the week, I was just naming to God, this is what I'm anxious about, and Lord, I want to give this to you. If you're sitting in unanswered questions about your life, you've got big things that God just hasn't answered, hold that intention before God. There's no, be patient. We can't push a resolution for something that is unresolved in our hearts. We can't force clarity there isn't any. But we can take it to God and say, "God, this is unanswered. This is how it makes me feel. This is how it makes me feel not to have an answer." And just do that exchange with him. And ask ourselves why some of the reasons why maybe we find it difficult to meet with God in our emotions. We hear that the disciples, Jesus' apprentices, they fall asleep. It says in verse 45, when he rose from prayer, he went back to the disciples and found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. They weren't able to keep praying and meeting with God in that place. So maybe just ask ourselves, why is it we're having a hard time taking our emotions to God? Is it fear? Is it that when we get to that quiet place, and you know what, this probably was the case for me for a long time, was I was a bit worried that if I get to that place of intimacy with God, what if there's nothing there? What if there just isn't intimacy? What if I'm a fraud and I'm not really a Christian? And I know that sounds crazy, but that was a genuine fear for me. What if I get face to face with God and we've got nothing to say to each other? I think that comes to trust, like trusting that God has his best for us. He wants relationship with us. And I want to speak that to you today, that if you are really struggling to spend time alone with God, maybe that's a trust issue. We'd love to pray for you, whether that's in the Zoom meeting after the talk, whether that's in the one-to-one prayer that I mentioned. We'd love to pray for you. Maybe that we're not willing to feel pain. We're not willing to go there with our negative emotions and process them in front of God. We just kind of want to avoid that suffering and pain. But remember that we're humans, we're emotional beings. God gave us emotions by design. And the design is that they tell us about the health of our heart. They tell us how we're really doing. Are we suffering? Do we have fear? Is God putting his finger on something in our life? Are we joyful? Have we got things to praise God for? Are we anxious? Are we feeling lonely? Our emotions are there to tell us the state of our heart, and that then we can do business with God in that quiet place, processing them, letting God tend to our heart, letting him allow us as we be with Jesus to become more like him. As we read in that chapter in Matthew 11, that we'll learn to live freely and lightly. That's about learning to do emotions from a healthy place as much as anything. But what if our emotions are guiding us? What if they're dictating to us? We need to realise that if we don't process our emotions in a healthy way, they'll start to control us. If we don't see them as just a readout of how our heart's doing, but actually we start to read them as who we are, we start responding accordingly and listening to them. And if we do that, our emotions will wear us out. They'll give the enemy a foothold, cause us to act in ways that aren't us. We'll start to perform habits, get into habits that we wouldn't otherwise. And then, as we spoke about in the words of Jamie K. Smith, the things we do something to us. As we start to act out from our emotions, that will get into our heart through the limbic system, as we just spoke a few weeks ago. They'll get into our heart, and then they'll get into our desires and our longings. And actually, we'll start to want from a place of emotion, where actually before our emotions were just giving us a readout. And so, let's put it this way. If we let our emotions drive our behaviour, then that behaviour will become our default. I mean, let's put this into a practical scenario. Let's give a bit of clarity around that. So imagine something happens to us and we're hurt, rightly or wrongly. It could be a just anger, or it could be, we've taken something the wrong way. We feel anger. It's boiling, it's burning. We realise that we're feeling it. And our human response is to justify it. It's correct that I feel angry. This has been done to me, that's been done to me. To be honest with you, and righteous anger is something I'm not going to go into today. We could do a whole message on that on itself, but it's a really narrow set of criteria that a real, true righteous anger, yes, Jesus did feel angry, but the criteria for that is a narrow set. But then we have a choice. We're feeling angry, we've been aggrieved, whether it's right or wrong that we feel anger. And now we have a choice to deal with our feelings. Do we take that hurt to God, or do we just sit in it? Do we live in our feelings? Do we allow ourselves to feel the anger? Do we allow ourselves then to become bitter, to harden our hearts towards the person that we're feeling angry against? And then, as we act in that angry way, as we allow our hearts to be hardened, our hearts change. We're no longer, the emotion can fade, the anger can fade. We're no longer operating from a place of anger. But now the thought's been gone, it's just a state of heart. It's baked into our heart that now we're just going to be closed off to that person. We're going to be bitter towards them. And to be honest, when we get to that point, that's when emotional unhealth has set in. It's not even that we're living from our emotions anymore. That emotion of anger has become who we are, at least in this certain area. Can you see that cycle? That's why it's important that if we're feeling angry, we take it to God. We realise that, God, I'm feeling angry. Rightly or wrongly, this is how I'm feeling, and I need to process in front of you. How do I come, like Jesus, to that place of surrender where we can pray God's will be done and operate from a place of health? Are you with me? Do you get why this is so important? Hopefully so. So maybe we can look at one more Bible story and just see if we can find some tools for how we navigate this in a godly way, rather than letting emotional unhealth set in. Maybe we can create a map for navigating maybe the treacherous waters of silence and solitude. As we take this seriously, as we learn to grow in intimacy with God, we're going to need to deal with our emotions as well. So let's turn to 1 Kings 19. So the context for this, Israel's in civil war. You've got the tribes in the north who are no longer following God. You've got 2 tribes in the south who are still loyal to Yahweh. You've got King Ahab ruling in the north and his queen Jezebel, who, to be honest, is a bit of a sociopath. And we've just, in chapter 18, we've read about Elijah having the highlight of his career. He's done battle with the prophets of Baal. He's prophesied that there's not going to be rain in the land for 3 years. And then he has this showdown with the prophets. And the idea is that they're going to call down fire from heaven. And first of all, the prophets of Baal go. And they're calling to Baal, send fire, set this on fire. They're cutting themselves and screaming, and nothing happens. And then Elijah, he goes the extra mile, and he says, remembering there's a drought, pour water all over the offering, all over the altar. And then he calls down fire, and Yahweh shows up. Bam! Fire. Yahweh wins. Elijah is like, yes, God's come through. And then Elijah calls for rain. And we pick this up then in chapter 19. It says this: when Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all of the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah: may the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them. Elijah was afraid for his life. He was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, that's in the south, and he left his servant there. Then he went alone into the wilderness, travelling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who already died. Do we sometimes feel like that? Do we get to a place where life's just too much? It's like, Lord, I've had enough. Take me. Elijah certainly did. Verse 5. Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, get up and eat. He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came and touched him and said, get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. But then the Lord said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And we can translate that. Elijah, how are you doing? Where are you at? What's happening at a soul level, Elijah? What are you feeling, and what does that mean about the state of your heart? Elijah replies, I've zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. Go out and stand in my presence. Me and you alone. That time of abiding, as we put it in the New Testament language. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the winds there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Again, that same question. Where are you at? What's the state of your heart? He replied again, I've zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, torn down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. It's the same answer that Elijah gives, but just perhaps it's a different tone. He's in a different place. And then the Lord said to him, "Go back the way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Then anoint Jehu, the grandson of Nimshi, to be king of Israel. And anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel-Meholah, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes from Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and those who escape Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I will preserve 7,000 others in Israel who have never bowed down to Baal or kissed him." And then we read at the start of the next chapter that Elijah goes and meets Elisha, and Elisha chooses to follow him. And I mean, the story of Elisha is fantastic. I love it. Go and read that if you want some extra reading this week. But as they go through the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19, I think there's a 7-stage pattern. It's not a formula, and actually this isn't something that I've come up with, I'll be honest. But there's this 7-stage pattern which I think can help us with navigating our emotions, that when stuff comes up, we can go through this with God and find resolution. And it's resting, waiting, feeling, naming, hearing, being transformed, and being restored. So that again, resting, waiting, feeling, naming, hearing, being transformed, and being restored. And so Elijah's scared. He's quite rightly scared for his life. The queen's promised to kill him. He's gone from this amazing high to this crashing low. And how often does that happen to us in life? We're on a high and something happens and boom, we're back down. That roller coaster of human emotion. And he's turned into depression for Elijah. He's praying to die. He's in a really bad place. And it's not a great prayer from Elijah, and Elijah's a really great prayer. Read some more of Kings and you'll see that he is a man of faith. But he's known enough that he needs to get alone with him and God. He's taken that step of going into the wilderness, now into the eremos. And I would love it to be the same Greek word that we were using last week. The Old Testament's written in Hebrew, so the word eremos isn't written, but I think it's the same concept. Elijah knows that he needs to go and get alone with God, that the resolution to this, how he's feeling, that he's so desperate to be in God's presence, that he just wants to get alone with him. And so the first is resting. There he rests in God's presence, and we hear that the angels come and be with him. And sometimes silence and solitude is really hard, particularly when we've got deep stuff going on. We don't read that Elijah's reading scripture or he's even doing a lot of praying. He just rests in God's presence. What I was getting at last week, he just abides. His inner center, his spirit, spending time with God, being restored and being refreshed and just resting in God's love. And, in the words of Jesus, being a branch on the vine. That's where we were designed to be, in relationship with God. And so Elijah rests. And then he waits. And in our microwave culture that we live in now, sometimes we can think we can just do one prayer session with God and everything's fixed. One time of silence and solitude and boom, we're done. But I don't think that's the case. Sometimes God takes time. Sometimes when it's deep, when it needs to be a deep work, it can take a while. And we can read that Elijah travels for 40 days and 40 nights into the wilderness. He heads for Mount Sinai, that place where the 10 Commandments were given, the mountain of God. Elijah heads there, and it takes him a while, 40 days and 40 nights. And then when he gets there, the next stage, feeling. God asks him, God said to him, Elijah, what are you doing here? How's the state of your heart? What's actually going on beneath the surface? And I know that I'm not the best at looking under the surface. Sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's unpleasant. Sometimes we don't really want to tell God what's going on in our heart, but he already knows. The reason he's asking is because we need to be willing to feel our emotions and sit them in there with God. And of course, doing this with God, as I mentioned last week, is the safe place to do this. If we don't process our emotions with God, they're going to leak out. They'll leak out over our loved ones and over our workplace and cause all sorts of disruption and damage in our lives, particularly if they're negative emotions. So we feel our emotions. Maybe we ask that question to ourselves. What are you doing here, Ross? Ross, how's your heart? Ask that question to ourselves in front of God, or allow God to ask that question over us. Then the next stage, naming. Give whatever you're feeling over to God. The good, the bad, the ugly. There's no need to be a filter. The point here isn't to be good, it's to be honest. As we said earlier, different emotions have different responses. And for me, like I mentioned at the start of the week, that I was feeling a bit anxious, and then God took me through a roller coaster of all sorts of emotions that I was feeling. And really, God's taken me to some deep, ugly places this week, of particularly the latter end of the week, just who I am and what's going on under the surface. And you know what? Sometimes I've really wanted to run away from some of those emotions. Like, it has been a really difficult week for me. But I've really had to dig deep, and I'm not done yet. There's a long way to go, but just be honest with my emotions and sit there with God. And I was, Thursday night, I was doing some talk prep, and I got to this point. I was like, God, I really need to do this for myself. I'm going to name how I'm feeling. And sometimes it's really helpful to do this out loud. And I did. And actually the words that came out of my mouth, and I'm not going to overshare, but the emotions that I told God I was feeling surprised me. Like, they weren't actually what I thought I was feeling. And when they came out, I was like, yeah, that's how I'm feeling. I am feeling this. God, why am I feeling this? What is it in my heart? Show me what it is in my heart that's causing me to feel this way. And kind of that's been the start for me. I've been able to take those things to God. It's going to be a journey for me. As I said, it's not a microwave culture. It's not a microwave instant fix. Sometimes we're going to have to sit in them for a while and allow God to minister to us. But today can be the start of that journey. And Elijah, he sits in his emotions and then he names them. He says, I've zealously served the Lord God, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant. They've killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. But as we name our emotions, we're also preparing our heart to hear from God, hear what he's going to say back to us. And so, as I said, someone challenged me this week. Silence and solitude isn't just mindfulness with Jesus or just emptying our mind. It's a place of encounter, a place of transformation. The place of the wilderness, the eremos, isn't a place of absence, it's a place of God's presence. It's a place where we can be transformed and changed, not just emptying our minds, but being filled with the knowledge and the presence of God. And so then we hear Elijah in the hearing stage, the next step, hearing. Elijah was desperate to be in God's presence, to hear from him. He's traveled for 40 days, he's tired, he's scared. And sometimes this isn't obvious until we get into God's presence. Sometimes, though we're desperate, we're like, God, I need a fresh touch from you. And Elijah needed to hear from God. He needed to be in his presence. And we read that God goes big for Elijah, the earthquake and the wind. God's presence appears. But then there's the whisper. The transformation stage, kind of going to put the two together, that as Elijah hears the whisper of God, we don't know what God says to Elijah, but as he hears from God, something changes in his heart. We know that he's transformed, that he journeys through his emotions, because God asks again, Elijah, how are you doing? What's the state of your heart? And Elijah gives the same answer, but this time something's different. Because we don't hear again about Elijah feeling this way. That in front of God, he's processing his fear and he's processing how he's feeling and his emotions. He meets with God, he hears from God, and then God restores him. God gives him direction. He says what's going to happen. These are the things that's going to happen, and here's something you need to do. Go and anoint Elisha. Go and anoint Jehu to be king. To be king of Israel, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram, and Elijah to be your prophet, to follow on from you as prophet. And it wasn't a quick process. Elijah journeyed for 40 days to get to God. So I'm not saying when we realize his emotions in one sitting, as we learn to actually not be dictated, not to be guided by our emotions, but to get them as a readout of our heart. As we learn to process what that readout of our heart is. I'm not saying it's going to be quick. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't, sometimes it won't. Sometimes we need to sit and let God tend to us. And it's a deep work. And whether we do that just in the presence of God, and maybe sometimes we want to do that in one-to-one prayer. And I encourage you to take advantage of what Gemma's setting up this week. But hopefully that's not, it's not a foolproof process, but hopefully it's just a bit of a map that we can take. So resting, waiting, feeling, naming, hearing, being transformed, and then being restored. The last one, on the other side, after Elijah's gone through dealing with his emotions, he goes out. We read that he goes and he calls Elisha to follow on from him as prophet. And so what am I saying? Emotions, honestly, they're a big topic. Being emotionally healthy is a series in itself, but I don't want to encourage us to go to the place of silence and solitude, which is such a good thing. It's been so transformational for me. It allows us just us and God alone in his presence and his love. To get to that place, though, we need to learn how to deal with some of that inner chaos that comes up, some of those emotions. It'd be reckless just to say, go off and do it, and not give you some tools and some pointers to deal with that. But after all, as we take our emotions to God in silence and solitude, that's the safest place to deal with them. Let's not live from the surface. Let's live from our hearts. But let's learn to tend to our hearts in the same place. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think, again, I use this verse from Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guard our hearts. Live from a place of living from that deep inner core that is our heart. Learning to, as we spoke about, like the practices are a part of curating our heart, curating our loves. Again, let's be careful with our emotions. That emotions are a readout of the health of our heart. They're not something that we live from and then allow to become part of our heart. And so maybe that's challenged you this week. Maybe you've just realised you're feeling loads of emotions that you can't wait to take from God. Maybe you're just starting out, and actually this week you're just going to start with some silence and solitude. And just, if you missed last week's talk, it's on YouTube, it'll be on the website. I encourage you to listen to that, because getting alone with God is so key to being an apprentice and a disciple of Jesus. And so normally, if we were doing this in a church setting, I'd probably call us forward for one-to-one prayer for us to deal with some of that stuff. We're not going to do that now. Dial into Zoom, the link's in the chat. You might be on Zoom already. And let's just join prayer groups and pray for each other. But if you really want an extended time, I encourage you to engage with that one-to-one that Gemma and the team are going to be offering. You'll find more details about that on the website. So let me just pray for you as we go. Just as we, just process some of what we've heard this morning. Let's just hold out our hands ready to receive. Holy Spirit, thank you that you're with us. Even as we're separated from each other, that you are with us, that you're moving in our hearts, you surround us, you're within us, and that you are a place of safety, that we can learn to become more like you, Jesus, through these different practices and through the use of our time. But it's you who's calling us to do that in love and in peace, that we can live that light and free life that you demonstrated to us. And so as we go into this week, I just want to pray a blessing over you, church. Just pray the peace of God, that you would know his presence, and that you would just be able to live from a place of belonging and knowing that God is for you. So, church, I just pray peace over you, that you would just go forth this week in the love and the knowledge of Christ. Amen. Amen. So join the Zoom now. I'll see you there, and then after we prayed for each other, we'll just continue to gather and just chat and hang out. Bless you, church.